Hey, Cypher here. As many of you may already know, many states in the US kind of hate each other. And it's not because they choose one is better than the other, although sometimes people will definitely argue that. Instead, oftentimes it's based on a lot of history. And today I wanted to start a series that was talking about the history of state rivalries. Now, I've been going to the University of New Mexico to get my PhD in history, and so you can guess which state I want to talk about first. New Mexicans have a pretty unique hatred for Texans, and that history between Texas and New Mexico has actually been continuously violent for about a century. Now, as an aside, I'm actually starting this series with another channel, Mr. Beat, who's going to be covering Kansas versus Missouri because, well, he lives in Kansas, and that was also a pretty violent rivalry. So be sure to go check that out. But before you do, let's talk about why New Mexico hates Texas. Some of the oldest cities in the United States are in New Mexico. The capital, Santa Fe, was founded a year before the Virginia colony, let alone the Pueblos, which are hundreds of years older than that. But in 1680, those Pueblos revolted and kicked out the Spaniards for over a decade. The Spaniards returned in 1692, but this cemented Nuevo Mexico as the last missionary province in Spain's northern frontier for a century. Tejas, on the other hand, was initially founded as a bulwark against the French, who were coming down the coast. It was essentially a defensive colony. Once Spain was given the Louisiana Territory in 1764, the defense of Tejas was focused on American Indians. As the mission system grew there, Comanches menaced the border, and they would continue to do so. Nuevo Mexico was able to conclude a peace treaty with many Indian tribes in the 1770s and 80s, but Tejas was too sparsely populated to be in contact with the nearby Nuevo Mexico. They remained defensive. After the Mexican Revolution destabilized these relations, Tejano land grants were given to Americans to fight the Comanche threat. They grew more divisive and ended up declaring independence in 1835, and successfully fought Mexico's attempts at retaking the territory. Now realize, Nuevo Mexico was unaffected by the Texan Revolution initially, since they were dealing with their own dissent, called the Chimayo Rebellion. But Texas had different plans. They claimed all the land east of the Rio Grande, including Santa Fe, despite having no power or historical claim to the territory. But Texas acted on their claims. In 1841, Texas sent an expedition disguised as traders along the Santa Fe Trail. But as one of the expeditionaries remembered, the commander of the expedition, General Lamar, had an ulterior intention, that of bringing so much of the province of New Mexico as lies upon the eastern or Texan side of the Rio Grande under the protection of his government. That failed miserably. Traveling the distance necessarily exhausted the expedition, and they were made to surrender to the superior forces of the Nuevo Mexicanos. Since they capitulated unilaterally, they were sent to Mexico City under harsh conditions. Texas made their expedition into an ordeal that somehow further asserted their claims to the disputed territory known as the Nueces Strip, which included Santa Fe. Well, that claim was maintained even once the US annexed Texas in 1845, leading to the war with Mexico a year later. This brought New Mexico into the US as well as a lot of other land. California didn't want all the land Alta California had occupied, so a lot of American New Mexico was added, including as far afield as current southern Nevada. But there were still those Texan claims. As late as 1850, 2 years after the end of the war, Texas still claimed all of the eastern side of the Rio Grande. It was so bad that they sent public officials who were refused in the territory, and almost sent militia into New Mexico to take the land. One U.S. senator said, "Should Texas raise troops and march them into New Mexico for any such purpose, she would be making war against the United States, and all engaged would commit the overt act of treason and subject themselves to the traitor's doom." This was a terrible situation. The US Army, after having just fought a war for Texas, might have to fight one against Texas. And New Mexico was stuck in the middle, trying to keep her newly formed sovereignty and even begging for statehood like California. The crisis was averted by the Compromise of 1850. Texas could not claim New Mexican lands, and New Mexico was forced to be a territory rather than a state for decades to come. This dispute between Texas and New Mexico was never resolved. You'll still hear gripes about Texas having a sliver of land beyond their mandate. But there is much more animosity than what happened in 1850. Another expansion of land took place in 1854 with the Gadsden Purchase, all of which was put into New Mexico. It was a vast territory already, and this new addition was problematic. South of the border, the purchase was known as the Treaty of La Mesilla, because a town called La Mesilla was inside the lands, and it had been created by Mexico to offer refuge for those fleeing American territory. Well, those refugees became part of the same United States they were running from anyways. Oops. They were not too happy about the position, and dissent spread to faraway Tucson, New Mexico. They almost immediately began campaigning for their own state, or territory, and would continue to do so into the 1870s. I cannot pinpoint when, but they began to identify with slavery's cause, much to the chagrin of northern New Mexico. This tipped the balance in slavery's favor, and the territorial legislature voted to legalize slavery in New Mexico in 1859, which many saw as an encroachment by Texas. When the secession crisis loomed in 1861, southern New Mexico was keenly aligned with Texas. A Texan newspaper once said about the leading newspaper in La Mesilla, "The Mesilla Times is pro-slavery in politics and advocates a Southern Confederacy with great force. We learn that it represents the general sentiment of the people of the region." This alignment erupted after the Civil War began. The people of Tucson and La Mesilla voted to join the Confederacy. They declared, "We will not recognize the present Black Republican administration, and that we will resist any officers appointed to this territory by said administration with whatever means in our power." Essentially, they had declared independence of a new territory, Arizona. Not that Arizona, this one. Texas, seeing what was happening, jumped at the opportunity. General Baylor reported, "I determined to occupy Mesilla and prevent, if possible, the enemy from getting a position there, as it was one that would be easily held, and would enable them to hold the country." So he invaded what northern New Mexico considered to be theirs. This was part of a larger issue, which I'm going to have Mr. Beat explain.
Heck yeah, Cypher. I'm Mr. Beat. I'm out here sweating my butt off to tell you that when most people think of the American Civil War, they think of the eastern theater of the war, the battles in the east like Antietam, Gettysburg, the Bull Runs. All these happened over there, you know, back east. But the Civil War was going on out in the west, too. When historians say, quote, Western theater, it's basically the Mississippi River, like Vicksburg and all that. But go further west and stuff is still going on. They call it the transhumanist theater of the war. Just kidding. They call it the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the War. And some of it happened in New Mexico territory. At the beginning of the war, the Confederates felt they could capitalize on capturing New Mexico since it'd probably be pretty easy. Several felt the Union had neglected them for so long. There was also rebel sympathy in Southern California on the Pacific Coast Theater of the War. But there were other big reasons for the Confederates to capture the West. They could expand slavery out there, just like slavery proponents had been trying to do for decades before the war. I mean, this was why the whole war started. They could also get access to the gold and silver mines in both California and Colorado territory. Gold and silver is always pretty helpful. And finally, they needed a way to escape the Anaconda Plan, the Union's strategy that created a blockade of southern ports and split the Confederacy in two by controlling the Mississippi River. Those blockades really hurt. If they could just get access to those precious seaports in Southern California, it would greatly help ease their pain. Speaking of the American Civil War, do you know where most historians say it really began? Right here where I stand. Literally where I stand. In my home freaking state of Kansas. For more on that, check out my video about why Kansas hates Missouri after you're done watching this one.
Be sure to check out Matt's video as well. So in 1862, after consolidating power in Confederate Arizona, the Texans invaded the northern part of New Mexico. General Sibley declared his plan was to take possession of it in the name and for the benefit of the Confederate States, by geographical position, by similarity of institutions, by commercial interests, and by future destinies. New Mexico pertains to the Confederacy. Well, that failed. In the quickest moving front of the Civil War, the Texans were whipped in Glorieta Pass and sent running back to Texas, where they would remain for the rest of the war. As the California column came to take Mesilla back, it was reported that more than 1,000 men of the Arizona Territory are waiting with open arms to receive the liberal government of the North. This was the third Texan invasion. First was 1841, then 1861, and finally 1862 ended their attempts. But it forever shaped New Mexican politics. The first rift came in 1863, when New Mexico was split in twain by Congress, making the Union Territory of Arizona. Yes, now that one. Arizona's fate was entwined with New Mexico still, having many of the violence issues that New Mexico had, including the plague of range wars and political assassinations that came after the war. The two territories even gained statehood simultaneously in 1912. But Arizona has retained that angry streak of her Confederate past, and this has made Arizona the incredibly conservative state it remains today. Texas also maintained its conservative past, but that affected New Mexico's history after 1863. As a group eventually known as the Santa Fe Ring gathered Republican power in the territorial capital, Texans immigrated into the more conservative southern part of the territory. Trying to break up the South's considerable legislative power and ruin Texan influence on New Mexican politics, the county of Doña Ana was split in three in 1869. In spite of the Democrats who made up the conservative Texans, the new counties were named after the martyred President Lincoln and the one who vanquished the Confederacy, Grant. So they broke Texan power by making counties named after their sworn enemies. What a move. Well, this animosity inevitably blew up. Republican natives and Union newcomers fought incoming Texan Democrats and native sympathizers in a series of conflicts one historian has dubbed the Western Civil War of Incorporation. Here's an incomplete list. It's a lot more complicated than simply Texans versus New Mexicans, but let's just say they tended to fall on separate sides. I'm probably going to write my dissertation on this subject, so you know there is a lot more than I can say here. One of those conflicts happened to be named after the county that had been so antagonistically named Lincoln. Yep, the one they've made a bunch of movies about. Heck, a fairly minor figure in the Lincoln County War has been one of the most depicted historical characters in Hollywood, Billy the Kid. The governor, who was appointed to bring the war to a close, was too busy writing another Hollywood darling, Ben-Hur. Oh yeah, I could talk about this stuff for days, but let's just say Texans like John Chisholm were often at odds with the Santa Fe Ring. It was all ridiculous political violence for the sake of currying greed. You also can't forget that Texans were normally white, whereas the majority of New Mexico's population was Hispanic until after World War II. So there is also an element of racial hatred engendered by this violence. It all eventually calmed down, especially after what was known in New Mexico as the Texan Flood ebbed away. Texans had been settling New Mexico as they swept westward, bringing their conservative democratic politics with them. But the Rio Grande Valley ended their push. By the time New Mexico got statehood in 1912, the violence between New Mexicans and Texans was over. But another batch of violence still was yet to come. This time it wasn't Americans versus Americans, but Americans versus Mexicans. As the border war grew worse during the Mexican Revolution, Texas and New Mexico sought different strategies. Texas was protected by a river border, but they were far more aggressive. Texas Rangers and vigilante groups fought open battles with a group of insurgents trying to implement what was called El Plan de San Diego. Essentially, it was a secret filibuster plan from Mexico into the United States. Even after the San Diego Plan had been vanquished, what was called the Bandit War continued, and violence was endemic. New Mexico remained aloof until 1916, when Pancho Villa raided Columbus. the state became a staging ground for the response, the Pershing Punitive Expedition. So Texas was actively fighting Mexican insurgents, whereas New Mexico was fighting a reactionary offensive. The Pershing expedition failed and returned after receiving the Zimmerman telegram, which was meant to hinder the United States further. Texas would incidentally be the last to fight against Villa in the Third Battle of Juarez, because it threatened the Texan city of El Paso. The border war was over, but the antagonism over how to deal with immigrants remains today. New Mexico is much more open to Mexican immigrants, whereas Texas has a wall for much of the Rio Grande. While you'll mostly hear New Mexicans today complain about Texan drivers, arrogance, and bigotry, the underlying history is there. New Mexico fought 3 invasions from Texas, years of fraudulent claims, and decades of violence from the Texan flood. Well, at least today, it is only a state rivalry. To take possession what the hell?